Hi there, it's Dr. Hall again. This is our second to last unit in the course. So we're going to be talking about food and drugs from a public health perspective. So this is the overview of what we're going to talk about in this unit. So in terms of food, we're going to want to make sure people are getting enough food in terms of both enough calories and enough of the different nutrients that we require. We want to make sure that then the food is also safe, so it doesn't contain harmful substances, primarily infectious diseases, and that was really the impetus behind the beginnings of the Food and Drug Administration and a lot of food regulation. But also we want to make sure there aren't toxins in it, that it isn't especially unhealthy for us, those types of things. And then we want to make sure that there's a safety mechanism for people who are sensitive to or allergic to different components in the food. When it comes to drug and other substances, we're going to talk about prescription drugs and vaccines and what the approval process for those is, and then also talk about the ways in which the FDA primarily regulates blood products, medical devices, dietary supplements, and cosmetics and personal care products. So before we dive into that, I think it's illustrative to talk a little bit about the history of the development of the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, because it helps shine some light on some of the issues that we still have today that we have to be cognizant of and thinking about. So before the 1900s, it was the Wild West in terms of drugs and food. There was no regulation of everything, certainly no nanny state, no big government. There was practically no government when it came to regulation of consumer products in general. So you could buy cocaine, you could buy narcotics, you could buy all kinds of patent medicines that contained arsenic or all kinds of crazy things and were not at all effective in any way, shape, or form. Food processing plants were really unsanitary, and foodborne illness and outbreaks of foodborne illness were really common. There were toxic dyes and additives added to food to make it look healthy, even when it wasn't. So it was a really dangerous time to be a consumer. And it's really important to think about how that changed and why that changed. And one big reason why that changed is because of the work of journalists. Oh yeah, I forgot to. So, you may be aware that Coca-Cola was initially marketed as a brain tonic, so it was almost like a medicinal thing, and it did contain cocaine, right? So the original recipe until 1904, Coca-Cola actually contained cocaine. So yes, it would help you feel energized, and here it's marketed for treatment of headache. I'm sure it did make you feel better. Um, so anyway, so the people who kind of helped us realize that this was a problem were journalists. So Upton Sinclair is really famous for writing a book called The Jungle, where he talked about the not only dangerous but also unsanitary conditions in meatpacking plants in the district in New York City, in Manhattan, where a lot of that activity took place at the time, in the meatpacking district. And it was just shocking and horrifying to people. They had no idea that this was what was going on. And so he became part of a group of journalists and writers called the Muckrakers. And they did a lot to expose corruption and scandals and unsafe practices happening in many different aspects of society at that time. And so I just wanted to make a nod to, as much as we often vilify media, and sometimes rightly so, they are also the way that we know what's happening in our world. They are kind of a check to make sure that organizations are doing what they say they're doing, and can be really helpful to us as a society in trying to improve our conditions. So in response to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, as well as many other exposés that were happening in the magazines of the time, In 1906, the U.S. Congress then passed the Federal Food and Drugs Act, and that specifically just required accurate labeling, but it also gave the FDA authority to remove a drug from the market if it was proven to be harmful. So when it was first formed, they did not have to prove that it was effective. So, still we had things marketed saying this will cure this and this will cure that, and it probably just made you feel high. But anyway, but they could withdraw something if it was proven to be harmful. So there's that proof of harm standard, which we often see in the United States. Then there was a really unfortunate incident that happened with a manufacturer of a drug called sulfanilamide in Tennessee. And there's a media assignment about that for you for this unit. And unfortunately, the sulfanilamide, which was the antibacterial, kind of the antibiotic agent in the medicine, was fine. But in order to make it into a syrup, they dissolved it in what we now use as antifreeze. And so that is highly toxic, but it was not known at the time. And so then it was like, oh gosh, right? And people, hundreds, I think like 100 people died, right? So this was really horrible. And so they said, well, maybe we should establish that something is safe before we allow you to sell it. So in 1938, then, the Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that said you have to prove safety first. You cannot market something as a drug until you prove to us and we agree that it is safe. It also, interestingly, for the first time, required that certain medicines needed a physician prescription. So before that time, anybody could just walk into a pharmacy and buy themselves some laudanum or some morphine or some sulfanilamide, perhaps on the recommendation of a physician, or you just walked in off the street and said, yeah, that looks like it should help. So it wasn't until 1938 that you needed a physician prescription to get certain medications. So that was helpful. And then there was a big tragedy that happened in the 1960s with a medicine called thalidomide. So thalidomide was marketed as a sleeping pill, but it was found to be very effective at treating morning sickness in pregnant people. It was approved at that time by the drug agencies in Europe, and so was used extensively actually in the United Kingdom. And what happened was that the babies born to these mothers who took this medication were born without limbs. They were born without arms and legs, or sometimes just without arms, sometimes just without legs. So huge, massive birth defects. Interestingly, it took them quite a while to figure out that the thalidomide was the problem because they had been doing some nuclear weapons testing also in the country at the time. And so people kind of thought maybe it was that. So thank goodness epidemiologists got on the ground. They did all their studies to try to establish contributory cause, and finally were able to establish that thalidomide was the cause of this. In the United States, thalidomide was never approved by the FDA due to the heroic work of a scientist, Dr. Frances Kelsey. And so you'll see a video about her also as part of the media assignments. But after this occurred, it kind of renewed public attention to the role of the FDA at that time. And we already had rules for requiring safety testing, but then they said, you know what, we actually should require that some proof that the drug actually works for what it's being marketed for. And so in 1962, some amendments were passed that said that drugs not only had to prove that they were safe, but they also had to prove efficacy. They also had to prove that they worked before they could be sold in the United States. It also required that information on potential side effects be given to patients. So now if you get a prescription medication, you'll often get the little package insert that not only tells you about directions for using the drug, but also tells you all the potential awful side effects that could happen to you as a result of using that. So that's kind of a history of the FDA. You'll notice that this is kind of reactive, right? So after something bad happens, then we say, maybe we should do this a little bit differently. Okay, So let's talk about the regulation of the food system. We're going to spend a little bit less time about this and more time about drugs, but this is no less important, especially because it's estimated that 1 in 6 Americans acquires a foodborne illness every year, and thousands of people, about 3,000 people a year, are estimated to die from infections related to food they have consumed. So it's not unimportant. So the first thing about food is, are you getting enough, right? So we do not want people to be suffering from starvation and malnutrition in our country. That's not good for anyone. It's not even good for our economy. So are people getting enough food in terms of, are they getting enough calories to sustain life, and are they getting enough of the specific nutrients? So we have two programs which you could think of as public health programs. They're really social welfare programs, but it also has a huge impact on health. So administered by the USDA. So we have the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which was previously known as food stamps. So this is assistance for purchasing food items, especially healthy food, for low-income people. As you are well aware, often the healthier food choices are the more expensive ones. This program has been enormously helpful to many families and particularly children. And we also have WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children, which is a program that primarily targets pregnant women and women with infant and young children to make sure that they are also getting sufficient nutrition. One interesting note is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, because of all the stresses on families and a lot of job disruptions for people, the SNAP benefits were increased significantly for many families during the pandemic, which has been excellent, right? A lot of people have lost work or been out of work or have had disruptions to work because their children have been at home instead of, in school or in daycare. And so this has been hugely beneficial to those families to make sure people aren't going hungry during this difficult time. But be aware that those supplemental benefits are now scheduled to expire this spring. So people are going to see a huge decrease in their checks. I was speaking with a Dunn County official, and it looks like, people who used to get about 100, who are currently getting about $200 a month in supplemental nutrition assistance, are probably going to see that go down to about $30 a month. $30 a month to help support purchasing of nutritious food. So we need to really think about that and at what level we can support these programs. So we also have decided from a public health standpoint that there are certain vitamins and minerals that are difficult sometimes for people to acquire naturally, and so we will fortify certain foods or supplement certain foods. So when you purchase milk and it says vitamin D milk, that's because vitamin D has been added to the milk. So vitamin D is a vitamin that we all make in response to exposure to sunlight. Those of us who live in the northern climes, during the winter, the sun is so low in the sky, you actually, even if you sunbathed naked on a -5-degree day, you can't make vitamin D because the correct wavelengths can't reach you. So vitamin D deficiency and rickets used to be a huge problem. And it was actually a researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who discovered this problem and first proposed fortifying milk with vitamin D. So real cool little Wisconsin link there. But what's been interesting too, and one of your media assignments is a nod to this, is that milk consumption by children has gone down significantly in the past couple of decades because of shifting kind of cultural norms. And we're seeing more vitamin D deficiency now, and we're actually seeing rickets again in children. So we might have to start rethinking our programs. We also enrich a lot of cereal grains. So if you ever look at a cereal box or any kind of baked good, you might say, enriched wheat flour. And those are enriched with folate. So folate or folic acid is a really important nutrient that helps formation of the spinal cord and brain of the fetus. And if a pregnant person does not have enough folate, then that can cause defects in the spinal cord and brain called spinal tube, neural tube defects. And oftentimes this happens at a time in pregnancy before you realize that you are pregnant. And so many manufacturers now enrich their flours, enrich their cereal grains with folate to just kind of increase the general folate consumption in the population. Another example is iodized salt. So iodine is a really important nutrient that we get primarily from vegetable products in areas where the soil is rich in iodine, but in many places in the United States, the soil is not rich in iodine. The other large place we get it is from seafood. So what happened before they started fortifying salt with iodine is that there were huge swaths of the country, so Appalachia, the Midwest and Great Lakes region, and parts of the Northeast that were called the goiter belt, because if you don't get enough iodine, your thyroid gland can't function normally and it starts to enlarge, and that's called a goiter when you have this big, large mass on your neck. So it was a real iodine deficiency, and goiter was a real problem before they started adding iodine to salt. So kind of cool. All right, so is food safe? So how do we ensure the safety of our food system from a communicable disease or infection, foodborne illness standpoint? So the FDA requires safety procedures for producers and processors, and there's routine testing and site visits and certifications that need to occur. We also, of course, as you know, have restaurant licensing and inspections to make sure that they are maintaining foods at the appropriate temperatures, to make sure that things are clean and hygienic, to help ensure the safety of our food supply. And then, of course, at both the local, state, and national level, outbreak investigation, so of potential foodborne illnesses, and then the ability to kind of do public education campaigns and recalls of potentially contaminated products. So another media assignment is on how outbreak investigations of potential foodborne illness occurs. We also need to think about, making sure that our food doesn't contain toxic chemicals or other contaminants. So FDA also sets acceptable levels that, your food can contain up to this much of mercury, say, and that's okay. But anything beyond that is not allowed. We also now label foods so that you not only can get a sense of how healthy it is, right? So you can kind of make nutrition decisions for yourself, well-informed nutrition decisions for yourself, thanks to the 1990 Nutrition Labeling and Education Act. Before 1990, there were not food labels. These labels did not exist. And I know you're like, oh, that's ancient history. That was much of my younger life. Right? So that was my childhood. There were no food labels. And then it gets updated periodically. One thing of note is that in 2006, it was updated to include trans fats due to the work of public health organizations. There are some other things that you'll find on food labels, right? So now many places will tell you if they contain ingredients that are common allergens. As someone who is relatively recently diagnosed with celiac disease, I super appreciate this. You would not believe what things wheat is in. Did you know it's in soy sauce? It's in soy sauce. It's also in the Reese's peanut butter Christmas trees and pumpkins and Easter eggs, but not in regular Reese's peanut butter cups, right? Crazy. All right. And you may have probably seen labels like this. So letting people know if a certain food contains phenylalanine, and that is specifically for people who have phenylketonuria. So what is that? What's that all about? I'm so glad you asked. So PKU, or phenylketonuria, is a genetic disorder of metabolism. It occurs in about 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 15,000 newborns in the United States. And what happens in this condition is if you eat phenylalanine, which is a type of amino acid, and amino acids are the chemical building blocks of proteins, so it's an ingredient in most proteins, it causes brain damage. and can cause seizures and profound mental retardation and just be devastating. So thankfully, now if you follow a special medical diet, we can prevent this, right? So now we have special medical diets and foods that are available for people who have PKU. But you need to know that you have it, and you need to know that you have it right away. So this is a condition for which all newborns in the state of Wisconsin are screened within the first couple of days after they're born. So let's remember our criteria for what an effective screening program is, right? So you want the disease to be relatively common. Now this one is not super duper common, so it doesn't totally meet that one. It's, it's not unheard of, but it's pretty rare. You want it to be serious. Is this potentially serious? Yes, this is potentially serious. In order for something to be effective, you want to have something that you can do that's going to make a difference if you make the diagnosis early. Absolutely. This one makes all the difference in the world if you catch it early. And you want to have an accurate test. We have an amazing test for this. And in fact, it's an incredible technology. So what we do with infants that are born is we collect a little bit of blood, we poke their heel, and we squeeze a little bit of the blood onto these little circles on a piece of paper. And we send that piece of paper into the state lab. And the state lab is able to test that piece of paper and screen that newborn for 47 different diseases with highly accurate screening tests. So this is amazing. And so even though many of the conditions that we screen for are not particularly common, they can be very serious. There are interventions that we can do early on that make a huge difference, and we have a really reliable test. So it meets all of the other criteria, and so that's why we screen for these conditions. But yeah, there's a bunch of them, and this is just one. Okay, now we're going to move in to talk about drugs of the type that are legally marketed. So we're not going to talk about illicit drugs in this lecture. That would be fun, but we're not, that's beyond our scope. So it's really important for you to understand the approval process that currently exists for both drugs and vaccines. It's going to be the same. So you'll recall that, those sequence of laws that gave the FDA its authority. Initially, it just said you have to require labeling, and then it said, well, no, you have to prove safety. And then in 1962, the amendment said, no, you actually have to prove efficacy before you can market something. So how does a company or a research institution go about this process? So there's 5 main steps. So the first is preclinical research. So this is, you're in the lab, you're working with cells in petri dishes, you're working with mice, right? You are testing out your hypotheses, you are trying different compounds, you are seeing if this potential medication or vaccine is safe and whether it is effective either in cells in a petri dish or in laboratory animals. So that's preclinical. Preclinical basically means pre-human, right? So that's all the background research that has to be done. And there's an enormous amount that has to be done for any new drug or vaccine. Then, once it looks like you've got a winner chicken dinner, once it looks like, yes, we think we found a compound that is safe and effective, then the first thing you're going to do is a phase 1 trial, where you're going to give the drug to a very small group of healthy volunteers. And what you're looking at is making sure it doesn't cause any major horrible side effects. You're also looking to see, well, if I give you this much in a tablet, what kind of blood levels does that result in? You're helping to understand the pharmacology of how the drug behaves in the human body, as well as just making sure that it's not going to cause a lot of harm, right? So you're going to do that just in a small group of people first. Once you pass phase 1, then you move into phase 2. So now you're going to give it to slightly larger groups of people, but still not all that many. And what you're looking for this time is to see if there's any signal that it works, that it's effective. So this is often called proof of concept, right? So now you're going to give it to enough people to say, hey, does this blood pressure medicine actually reduce blood pressure in people? Or does this vaccine actually reduce the likelihood that somebody might get severely ill from an infectious disease? If phase 2 proof of concept shows a signal for efficacy as well as continued safety, so you also have to assess for safety in phase 2, then you can move on to phase 3. So phase 3 is large randomized controlled trials. So what you're going to do is you're going to have one group of people to whom you give the drug or vaccine, and then another group of people, which is your placebo group, to whom you do not. So then you can compare and contrast the outcomes in those two different groups of people. And you're going to randomize people. So that's really important. You can't allow people to choose which group they want to be in. You're going to randomize them, and you're going to make sure that the age ranges in the two different groups are largely the same. The different types of medical problems that are present are largely the same in the two groups, because you don't want it to be skewed one way or another, right? You want to make sure that any effect that you see is due to the effectiveness of the drug or the vaccine. So those large randomized controlled trials, you are also going to be assessing for efficacy and safety, right? And now you're giving it in enough people that if it's a less common side effect, you are going to be able to find it. Now, most randomized controlled trials, you're enrolling thousands of people. You are not enrolling usually tens of thousands or millions of people. So it's important to acknowledge that if it's a 1 in 50,000 side effect or a 1 in a million side effect, you may not find it in those large randomized controlled trials because they're not big enough to detect very rare side effects. So then we move into phase 4. Oh no, I made a mistake. So then we move into phase 4, which is post-marketing surveillance. So sorry, I advanced the slide. I forgot. I thought I had another animation. I didn't. So just remember the last slide. So post-marketing surveillance is looking at then once the drug or vaccine is being used in the population, what's happening? Are we finding any side effects or things that we didn't pick up on in the clinical trials? And so, of course, in the case of the COVID vaccines, we have found some of those. So the blood clotting problem with Johnson & Johnson, the myocarditis with the mRNA vaccines, those all occur in about 1 in 50,000 people, right? If that many. So they're really rare. And interestingly, you are much more likely to get blood clotting problems or myocarditis from COVID. So your risk of myocarditis from COVID is about 1 in 500, just to kind of compare. But anyway, so since I'm talking about the COVID vaccines, so how did they get authorized so quickly? And so I'm going to point out that when the COVID vaccines were first authorized for use, it was through an expedited process called emergency use authorization. The pandemic was so devastating that it was determined that the benefits of getting the vaccines out more quickly would outweigh any potential risks of safety problems that hadn't yet been identified. Since then, the Pfizer vaccine has now been officially FDA approved, so it has met the usual standard that happened several months ago. But let's just talk a little bit about why we were able to get the vaccines for COVID out so quickly. And it's really because this was a full court press. This was an all hands on deck. This was an all resources devoted to this issue. So scientists all over the world came together and shared data. So within weeks of the virus being isolated in China, they had sequenced its genetic code and shared it with everybody. So everyone could start working on ways to combat this virus, from drugs to vaccines to everything else. Right? This is a huge global problem. And so the global scientific community really mobilized. So for example, one of our alums, Jack, he works at a research lab at Mayo in Rochester, and they normally studied viral vectors as a way to introduce treatments for different types of cancers. Their entire lab got redirected to using viral vectors as a way to develop a COVID vaccine, right? So labs all over the country pivoted and started working on this problem. Then our government, our federal government, actually devoted massive funds on other ways to help support this. So one example was Operation Warp Speed, which was a program from the Trump administration where they said, okay, we need to do everything we can to develop vaccines as quickly and safely as possible. And so they invested a lot of funds to do that. And they also allowed some other things to happen. So let's just kind of look at the other things that happened that resulted in the rapidity of the response. So one is that preclinical research had already been done for similar viruses and for these new vaccine technologies that the COVID vaccines use. So there had been a lot of vaccine research done for SARS, the SARS-1 virus, which obviously is a cousin to SARS-CoV-2, as well as MERS, which is the Mideast Respiratory Syndrome virus, which is very similar to SARS-CoV-2. And so they had done a ton of preclinical research already on very, very similar viruses. So they were able to just tweak it a little bit for the COVID virus. So that really worked out. They'd been working on these vaccines for over 10 years already. So that was really cool. The other thing that happened is that phases 1, 2, and 3, which are usually done sequentially, one after the other, due to the emergency of the pandemic, those were done synchronously. So they said, okay, we don't know for sure what dose is going to be best. We don't know for sure about safety, but we're gonna start enrolling people in randomized controlled trials and get those started. Not necessarily getting shots in arms, but get all of the administrative and organizational and infrastructure work going already before we even know if our vaccine candidates work at all, before we've met proof of concept, before we've demonstrated safety. So they started everything at the same time, which is not usually what happens. Usually preclinical research takes several years, and then you do phase 1 for about a year, and then you do phase 2 for about a year, and then you start recruiting people for phase 3, and it takes about a year to recruit, and then that study runs for 6 months, and then you take 2 years to write up your data. But this was all done sequentially, and people volunteered like crazy to help develop a COVID vaccine, which was fabulous and amazing. So we owe such a debt of gratitude to all the volunteers who stood up and said, yeah, I'll let you experiment on me because this is really important and I want to help in any way I can. The other piece, and this was in large part due to the federal response, was that potential vaccine manufacturers were basically guaranteed by the federal government. They said, go ahead and start building your production facilities. Go ahead and start getting everything ready to go so that if your vaccine works and is proven safe, you can start production that day. That's not usually how it works. Usually you prove that the vaccine is safe and effective, and then you start building your manufacturing plants because you don't want to potentially build all this stuff and then not be able to use it. But what the federal government did is said, go ahead and do it, and if it turns out you can't make that vaccine because it's not safe or effective, we'll cover the cost. Right? So it was a risk-free way for us to be ready with our manufacturing capacity as soon as we knew that the vaccines would work and be safe. So that's how they got out to the world so quickly. It really has been a triumph of biomedical science, as well as logistics and supply chain and a whole bunch of really interesting things. It's been a huge success, actually, in many ways. From a public health standpoint, the vaccination rollout has not been as successful, but in terms of getting these vaccines developed and available, enormous success. Okay, so that's prescription drugs and vaccines. What about non-prescription drugs? So they're often referred to as over-the-counter. These are things that you can buy without a prescription. They also have to demonstrate safety and efficacy before being approved. Now, if you are a generic company, you are great value and you're going to make a generic version of Tums, as long as you're using the same ingredients, basically, it's fine. You don't have to like apply for a new FDA approval, right? So there are these generally recognized as safe and effective classes of medications, and whoever is making them, it's kind of already been shown to be safe and effective, so you can go ahead with just kind of registering with the FDA as somebody who's producing it. And of course, there is some oversight of manufacturing facilities and licensing and those types of things to make sure it's safe and not contaminated. FDA also oversees blood products and medical devices. So they set standards for blood product handling and safety. So remember when we talked about public health institutions and we talked about how the American Red Cross is really responsible for the majority of the blood products in our country. They are following the standards and recommendations and inspections and all those types of things set by FDA, right? So there is oversight that occurs. And then FDA also authorizes medical devices, again, for both safety and efficacy. So everything from breast implants, and there's some controversy about those in terms of their safety, which is a fascinating topic. Joint replacements, right? Artificial hips, artificial knees, pacemakers, all kinds of implantable devices. Condoms are regulated as a medical device. And so this is good for you to know because every condom that's marketed in the United States has to pass certain quality standards. So sometimes I hear patients talking about only buying brand name condoms because then they know that they will be more reliable. And that's actually false. So all condoms have to meet the same quality standards and ability to withstand certain mechanical stresses. So all of them will work equally as well. You just might like the feel or texture of some more than others. That would be the reason to buy a certain brand over another. And then other medical devices like IUDs or the implant for birth control are also regulated by the FDA, and they have to demonstrate both safety and efficacy before they can be approved and marketed. Those are the things for which FDA has really broad authority to require demonstration of both safety and efficacy before things can be marketed or sold to the public. There are other products, however, that FDA also has a hand in but has much less authority over. Dietary supplements is one. So dietary supplements are kind of considered a food product rather than a drug. And so they do not need to demonstrate either efficacy or safety to the FDA. The manufacturer alone is responsible for ensuring that it is safe. FDA can recall a product if it is proven to cause harm, which is a difficult standard to meet. But these products, as long as they say it's a dietary supplement, they can sell basically whatever they want. And it's kind of the Wild West for dietary supplements. So you never really know for sure if they have even in them what they say they have in them. It's just up to the manufacturer. Certainly if somebody has been proven to not include in their supplement the ingredients that they said were in their supplement, then the FDA can take action because that's a mislabeling infraction. But the FDA does not check and make sure that it actually contains what it says it contains before it is sold and marketed. It's very similar with cosmetics and personal care products. So personal care products is everything from shampoo to body sprays to deodorants to hair gel, anything that you might put on your body. Interestingly, soaps are considered separately, but body washes would usually be in this category. So there is a handful of restricted ingredients. So you cannot put mercury in personal care products in the United States, and there's some other chemicals that are likely unfamiliar to you. But they do not, again, just like with the supplements, they do not need to prove safety to the FDA before they can sell this on the market. Manufacturers are solely responsible. They do, however, need to accurately label the product, and it needs to include some instructions for how to use and the ingredients that are in it. And if it's an antibacterial product, for example, the EPA is involved in regulating that. And if they designate it as organic, the USDA is actually in charge of the official organic label. But again, in terms of cosmetics and personal care products, the FDA can act if something has been shown or proven to be harmful, but there isn't any assurance that happens before something gets to market. There was an effort in 2010 to improve the ability of FDA to restrict the use of certain products in cosmetics and personal care products. So it was called the Safe Cosmetics Act. And this was an attempt, and there were several Congress people who sponsored this bill, including Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, so one of our two senators. And it largely developed due to concerns about something called endocrine disrupting compounds. And so endocrine disrupting compounds are any of a number of chemicals that are used in a wide variety of consumer products that mimic or interfere with the normal hormonal system in the body. And so they have been shown, so there's many different types of endocrine disrupting compounds and chemicals, and they have been shown to cause to be associated with, right? So think about how we establish contributory cause. So they're associated with lots of hormonal problems, lots of reproductive problems, as well as some metabolic problems like obesity, diabetes, elevated blood pressure, and the one that you can't see because my head is in the way is dyslipidemia or high blood cholesterol. And in fact, just this a month or two ago, a new study came out showing that people with higher levels of phthalates, which is that third bubble there, phthalates in their body seem to be at significantly increased risk of premature death in their 50s and 60s from heart disease. So this was proposed back in 2010. It has never made it to the floor for a vote. It has gone nowhere. So this is a reminder, so we talked about this in the environmental health and safety lecture, of the different regulatory approaches. And we've kind of seen this throughout the history of the FDA. So in the United States, we tend to use a proof of harm approach, whereas in the EU, for example, they tend to follow the precautionary principle. And if there's a suggestion that something could be harmful, then they regulate or ban it. So when it comes to personal care products, for example, EU actually bans phthalates, the 7 most commonly used phthalates in personal care products. They also ban parabens, which you may have heard about, which are also endocrine disrupting compounds that also seem to increase your risk of cancer and are frequently found in lotions and sunscreen. They ban lead, which is interestingly used as a pigment in a not insignificant number of lipsticks in the United States. The FDA currently contends that the amounts of lead are so small as to not be a problem, but I don't know, right? And formaldehyde. So formaldehyde is used actually in a lot of nail polish and other nail hardening products and things like that in the United States, and is a carcinogen. It does cause cancer. So, so again, that difference, is the formaldehyde in nail polish really a health threat to people? Probably not to the casual user. Is it a threat to maybe the person who works in a nail salon? Right? So interesting, different approaches. So food and drugs in public health, big topic, and a relatively quick lecture given all of that. So we want to make sure people have enough food and that they have enough nutrients. We want to make sure that they're not getting sick from their food in any of a variety of ways. And foodborne illness and outbreak investigations are a big part of public health at the local, state, and national levels. And then when it comes to drugs and other substances, we're primarily talking about the role of the FDA in assuring safety and efficacy of prescription drugs, vaccines, and non-prescription drugs, so things that are classified as drugs or medicines. Also, things that are blood products and medical devices, safety and efficacy have to be demonstrated before marketing. But when it comes to dietary supplements or cosmetics and personal care products, the FDA has very little authority over the safety efficacy, whatever. Does it make your hair glossy, right? They're not going to get involved in that, but has very little oversight of the safety of those particular products. So think about how any of the things we've touched on today relate to your topic for your final report. And if there are applicable things, please include them in your final report. Thanks.